Welcome to the Fractured Families podcast. I'm Charity, your dedicated parental alienation coach, here to guide and support families as they navigate the challenges of high conflict divorces and custody battles. On this podcast, we'll share insights, practical strategies, and hope for those on the journey toward healing and justice. Whether you're personally experiencing these challenges or just want to learn more about the complexities of parental alienation and custody disputes, you're in the right place. You are not alone. This is the Fractured Families podcast, where every voice matters and every story is heard. And if you find my conversation helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us reach more families who need it. Hi, thanks for joining the Fractured Families podcast. I have a special guest today, Melanie Gill from the UK. Melanie comes to us with a world of knowledge, vast experience in the space of parental alienation. Melanie is a attachment specialist, attachment psychologist, forensic consultant.
Attachment specialist, psychologist, forensic consultant.
There you go. I can't even say it. She's so qualified. Melanie, thank you so much for being a guest. We have so much to talk about. Your expertise is amazing. You've done so much research and you've been in this space for quite a long time. So I just kind of want to have this as an open forum Q&A. I want to focus on the alienated child, the impact this type of abuse that the alienating parent is inflicting on them has on them, and some of the long-term consequences. Thanks for joining.
I mean, what I'm saying more and more now is that the harm that's being done to children in this, particular toxic family dynamic is completely unique. I've worked for the last 20 years. I've also done very complex, what in the UK is called care proceedings, and care proceedings that cross over with criminal proceedings. So looking at, families who are going through really toxic and horrendous stuff. So I've been able to see the sorts of harms that are going on in the various different types of cases that come up. And when you look at cases in care proceedings where usually it's neglect, it's say sexual abuse, it's physical abuse, the harm being done there is really horrendous, but it's completely different from what's being done to children who are subject to alienating dynamics. And the alienating dynamics are so subtle and nuanced, which is why I believe that so many cases go completely unaddressed, because the experts who are looking at them and the legal professionals who are looking at them don't understand what's going on underneath the surface. In care proceedings, you can see what's going on in neglect. You can see that children aren't eating properly, that they're dirty, and that sort of thing. They've got marks on them and that sort of thing. You can see that. But in these cases, the harm is hidden. And of course, when children are questioned by professionals, they hide what's going on.
Yeah.
And, I've done a webinar, which is coming out soon, it's called Lie, Liar, Pants on Fire. And it shows that absolutely everybody in the family, including the alienated parent, they all lie. I mean, and it's just so complicated. What's going on with children is that they're being forced to not just, lie to, say, the other parent. They have to believe the lies that they're being told by the alienating parent. They have to lie to themselves. And then they have to also lie, to professionals. And as I said, and to the other parent. And that's so complicated in terms of the trauma that's happening. And all the other traumas are hidden. When you're living with a parent who you're actually scared of, that's what is going on with children who are being alienated, because they are starting to align with one parent because of fear.
Yeah.
Having a parent who is saying something and there's a discrepancy in what you know as a child and then what you're being told, again, that causes stress to the brain. Discrepancy causes stress to the brain. But of course, because you're in that environment as a child, you have to go with it. You don't have any choice. And this is the point, is children don't have any choice at all. Children have to adapt to the most powerful parent. There's one thing that we can see in these cases and in the families, is that you don't really get children who, when they're in the alienating environment, kick off and, do very, very bad behavior, continuously. They don't, because they are subject to such enormous fear. And that fear is not being picked up by professionals. And yet, when you use the right assessment tools, it absolutely shines through. You can see it in, in the engagement they have with the alienating parent. The fearful body language that they show, which is not obvious. You have to be able to, look at it frame by frame. You have to film and look at it frame by frame. And people would be astonished to see how children sort of adapt in order to hide the fear. It's just appalling.
So for professionals that are engaging their services with these children, the chances of them having that knowledge, what does that look like? Is that something that is well recognized, or does it take a special set of training and skills to start to recognize that hidden abuse?
It takes a special set of skills and training. Standard observation, which even if you've been taught how to observe, if you're just looking at it, standard observation gets maybe something, I think it's so low. I mean, it's something like 15% of what's really going on. So there's this vast bit that you can get truly wrong. And one of the easiest things to get wrong, and actually they got it wrong in care proceedings going back decades, is something called false positive affect. And it's when children use smiles to cover not just the harm that's being done to them, to protect the parent, but also the pain and the distress. And, you will have cases in the US, and we have cases over in the UK. And the most infamous one is a child called Victoria Climbier. And she was killed by her aunt, who had brought her over to the UK and basically thought she was an evil child. And so she was tortured. And there was an occasion where she had to go to hospital, and the staff just signed her out because she was dancing in the corridors. She was smiling, this huge, broad smile, and she went back and she was murdered. And you see the same thing in alienated children when, say, CAFCAS or guardians or social workers visit their schools, and they will present with these false smiles. But what you don't see is the smile doesn't actually reach the eyes. And what happens is this is automatic in children who are being harmed. They're not pretending, they're not acting. It's this form of adaptation which protects them and makes them look to the parent as if everything is okay. And what that does with the parent is the parent thinks everything's okay, everything's fine. And so they're not quite as fearful as they usually would be when they seek to control that child. And that simple smile fools so many professionals.
That is so heartbreaking. And it's so sad to recognize that it's missed so often. And the frustrating part is, as an alienated, targeted parent, you try to help them understand this, but you come off as the lunatic, as the crazy, right? Because you're so desperate for them to recognize that, yeah, my child is smiling and my child is laughing, or my child is saying, I've hurt them, but I never have. None of this started until the divorce or the separation or the custody. Nothing you say resonates with these professionals. And so as a targeted parent, you feel so helpless.
And the other thing is also that, an awful lot of these professionals, the majority of their work is going to be in care proceedings where they're looking at neglected children and that sort of thing. And when they come across a parent who is articulate, who is angry because of the great injustice that is being done to them, they see that as psychopathology. So that's being, translated as, you're not an angry parent. Actually, you're a bad parent and you're a harmful parent. And that can happen often. And I've seen that happen often. So the bias immediately goes to the other side, where the presentation of standard victimhood is understood and more easily accepted. And the point about, these cases is the level of deception across the whole thing. If you could go in right at the beginning and say, those are lies. And guess what? You can. We do have the tools to be able to do that. that's why I'm being, cancelled, shut out, obliterated, because the tools are there, and the tools have been there for a couple of decades, but they're not within the training of any of the sorts of professionals who are actually on these cases at
Right.
all.
And oftentimes, what I'm finding is these professionals make it worse because, to your point, they come in, there's a bias. And as soon as they have a perspective or a perception of what that targeted parent is, they don't deviate from that. They stay the course, and no amount of obvious evidence on that the child is being harmed is recognized at that point. Are you recognizing that as well?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I've gone over 20 years and I've seen some really brilliant guardians,
Yeah.
and I've seen some really brilliant social workers who have gone and actually done, the research and done specialist training on their own, and who have been able to do a lot of these cases and seen the patterns that emerge, because the patterns that emerge in alienators and the alienated and the children are pretty consistent, but they're not being explained. That's the other thing. In, too many cases, and especially in the UK now, they don't want the explanation. What they want is a quick route out. Let's deal with it this way. Let's do that. And children and the science of development are just being completely sidelined. But if you're not trained to look under the surface, and the problem with, say, psychologists in the UK, things like clinical psychology, counseling psychology, is that, that the main event for them is that they're therapists. They're therapists. And when you're a therapist, what you're doing essentially within the therapeutic relationship is you are testing hypotheses, and you tend to believe what you're being told. So when somebody tells you something, you then you think, oh, really? And you follow that route down there. You cannot do that in these cases. You have to go in with a completely neutral mindset, and you have to gather data. So you don't believe what you're being told, essentially. Everybody is treated exactly the same, and you use evidence-based science to assess everybody, but you absolutely don't follow a therapeutic model of engagement with them, because that's fatal. And if you think about social work, social workers are there to help. And again, so it's very difficult for them to come out of that position when they're faced with alienators are so incredibly good at controlling. Narcissistic personalities are so very good at not just controlling the narrative, but controlling people. We only have to look at the groups of collective narcissism that there are at the moment that are dominating governments and society. Because ultimately a standard person is scared of a narcissist.
Yeah.
And you tend to comply.
Yes.
And so, we're faced with a situation where these very harmful individuals gain the upper control. And if you can't cut through that completely and utterly and concentrate and explain in very great detail what is going on, not just who's lying, you need to know why that person is lying. Because if you don't know the why, then you're not going to be able to say, well, actually, that person, if they did that, things would improve. I mean, I have to say the chances of addressing the alienator are pretty low. They're pretty low because they won't engage. They seek validation from, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors who will listen to them unconditionally. But there are therapies out there that don't do that. And given all the background information, can really work. But it's very, very difficult. But the point is, you need to know why. Why has that person done that, behaved like that, thought like that? Because alienation can be unconscious. And I know that's very difficult for some people to think, but some severely traumatized people can be just reenacting what has happened to them and projecting all the distress and anger that happened to them in their childhood out onto what's happening to them now and how they see their children. And that's very difficult. But I have had a couple of alienators who have engaged in specialist therapy, and it has changed them. They have, they've basically thought, this is harming my children. And some of it is coming from me, and I
Mm.
have to do something about it. And when I said a few, I meant two.
I'd imagine that that number is not very large with this group.
No, no, I've had better luck actually with psychopathic parents,
Wow.
not in parental alienation
Yeah.
cases,
Right.
but in other cases. And there is a particular form of therapy when they're willing to engage. And I have had psychopathic parents who have wanted to change, and it's worked. And that is the skill of the therapy and the therapists that intervene in these cases is just nothing short of miraculous.
Oh, yeah.
But you need to know, you need to be able to present the therapist with exactly what has gone on. And of course, the majority of people are not able to say, well, this actually went on with me. That's what happened. I was this happened. You can't, it's not going to happen, which
Right.
is why so many cases don't work, because professionals go in and go, well, what happened? They're not able to tell you what happened. And because if they would, then it wouldn't be happening. So somebody whose behavior is stemming from their own parents' divorce, and their massive distress about one parent, suddenly becoming a non-parent, and that's in there eating away at them. And then they repeat that on their own family. They can't tell you that. They can give you the bare details, but they can't actually say, well, it's because of that. And I can see that what happened to my thought processing was that. But you give them an adult attachment interview, and that's the information you get, because what comes out of their mouth is a distorted narrative as they try and cope with the trauma of what happened to them when the memory is activated. And then when you analyze the discourse they've used, then you can start seeing where the trauma actually is. It's horribly complicated. But I'm speaking at the PASG conference in September, and I'm going to be showing some of the discourse analysis that you do in order to absolutely reveal the underlying trauma that is driving the behavior.
That's amazing. I mean, it's encouraging that you're talking about it and the research is being done about it. But when you're an alienated parent or you're targeted, and it comes out of the blue. For some parents, you're happily married. One day you say, well, you think you're happily married, and then you leave or you file for custody or whatever happens. And even when the relationship ends, they say, we're going to have a healthy co-parenting. They both agree. And then the flip of a switch, it changes. And these parents can't wrap their head around it. Nothing they do or say to that alienator changes. No comments or science about the impact it has on the child sways their decision. So this is really powerful, because a lot of the people that come on my show, that engage me in my social media, and that are my clients, they ask the question, do they change? Can they change?
They can change, but it takes specialist therapy. They can change, but they won't change. I mean, the point about narcissism is that it's actually a very lonely place, and you have got to that place through adaptation. You have got to that place because you could not rely on the people who were supposed to love you. At some point, you've been let down, or you've had some massive heartbreak, because actually becoming narcissistic to the extent that we're talking about, what I've found, it can happen across the lifespan when things get really bad. But an awful lot of the parents in these cases, it's been developing since childhood. What's happened is, in their childhood, they have not had the level of nurturing, proper, deep-seated nurturing that they needed for their brains to grow optimally. And so they carry that with them. When they have children, a love can be awakened in them that they actually haven't experienced before. And they want it just for themselves. They want it for themselves. They want to control it absolutely. And because it's a self-focus, it's a complete self-focus, they lose theory of mind and empathy. So those children become possessions, essentially. And the children are lost. I mean, the children are lost in their minds. They're not being thought of sensitively. All these things can be measured. All these things can absolutely be measured and explained using science. And then you can think, maybe we could do that. Because one of the things about the alienator is that the connection between them and their own children is heavily distorted as well. So the harm just caused by that very distorted attachment relationship, without all the other stuff that's going on, is amazingly harmful. And one thing that I recommended in several cases was for the alienator to have video interaction guidance with the children. Usually what had happened in the case is the children were removed to the alienated parent, and then to try and to build the relationship and stabilize the relationship back with the alienator was to use video interaction guidance, which takes moments of sensitive attunement, real, right brain to right brain stuff in films, clips it, and then shows these bits to the parent and gets them to have a real good look at it and think about what they've done. How did they get to that point where there is this particular form of eye contact, which, nice little fireworks should be going off in each brain. Now, it's worked maybe 2 times.
Oh my gosh.
Because when you're narcissistic, everything is turned inwards. It's very, very hard. So sometimes with the video interaction guidance, what you'll find is it just will not work. It won't work at all. Won't work at all. Because there's absolutely no connection, and the parent doesn't know how to make that connection. But that is one thing that has the possibility of working when the alienator picks themselves up by their bootstraps and thinks, I'm harming my own children. But as we know, it's very few and far between.
So with all that information, I have a question it's a really traumatizing question, because you think to what you're saying, that these narcissistic adult parents, this type of behavior started in childhood. So when you think about an alienated child that is in the care of a narcissistic parent, mostly 90% of the time, in most cases, and sometimes 100% if the outcomes are bad in the court case, what does that look like for that child that wasn't a two-home family and things were healthy? They had a narcissistic parent, but they had a well-rounded parent to balance them out. That well-rounded parent has been removed, and maybe they get 10% of time with that child, and it might even just be video, right? It's not even physical presence visits. It's sometimes just video calls. What does that look like for that child in that home of a narcissist?
It sets them on a path to narcissism themselves. So I've just done a webinar called The Fruit Doesn't Fall Far from the Tree, which explains this. But the point is that to have attachment input into your child, you need to be seeing them on a very regular basis. That doesn't mean the attachment is broken, because it can't be broken, because you are embodied within your child. But the point is that there's no influence anymore, and the children are left having to adapt to this immensely scary parent. I mean, as I said, the driving thing that goes on between an alienator and a child is fear, is absolute fear. And this child having to constantly adapt. And what you see in terms of attachment is that there comes a point quite often where any attempt at adaptation fails. So, the false smiles, the complete compliance, and it's still not working to bring the parent into a sensitive relationship. The poisonous stuff is still going on, and children get depressed because basically their way of adaptation is failing. It's failing, and their brain knows it's failing. And it's like, well, what do we do now? So they get depressed. And again, with children, childhood depression, it's not like adult depression. Adults can go, oh my God, I'm feeling so dreadful, I'm going to go to the doctor. A child, the adult, all-powerful adult, is their world. There is nothing else. They can't escape from it. They can't go to school and tell anybody because they're completely enmeshed with the alienating parent. So they hide the depression. And you can see it in the attachment interviews. And at PASG, I'm going to read from a couple of ones where you can see this depression. And then if it carries on, then the next stage is idealization, this false idealization of the parent, like Stockholm syndrome. So you'll get the child saying, one parent all bad. And this one, the things they do for me, you get these children going, oh, my parent is so fantastic and great, and they do this. And then it's like, well, that's normal parenting behavior, actually. And if that doesn't work, and by this time you've got something called dichotomous thinking, and that's very, very serious for the future mental health of children, in which their brain is busy, because your brain's there to protect you and it gets on with it. And so what the brain is doing is busy separating out information very, very quickly into good and bad in order to keep the alignment going with the alienating parent and appear, protect themselves, appear that they're agreeing, that everything is, yes, you're absolutely right. So the brain goes chop, chop, chop. And that puts them at risk of psychosis, of things like bipolar, because if you think about bipolarity, depression and hyperactiveness. But it's basically you end up with children they very easily negate things. They cannot cope with anybody coming up with a different opinion to themselves. Think how many groups and people we have in the world that think like that.
Mhm.
You can't disagree with these people because basically they can't emotionally regulate at this point, and they become very angry, and this is the route to narcissism. Now, if things get worse, you also get, and this tends to happen more with boys, I've found, you get something called a falsely assembled self, when basically a child becomes a chameleon because they are rootless and they're trying to please everybody. And in doing that, they lose themselves. They have no identity whatsoever. And so they just agree with what everybody says. They become these just very, very false people. They're shattered. And all this can happen in these cases. And then you can get this violent shift over into ways of behaving that are completely the opposite. And that's when narcissism entrenches, so that you show rage. Instead of inhibiting all your negative feelings, you start to show them, but you start to show them in a very deceptive way because you're being brainwashed. And so that's the pattern of narcissism, rage, and also this cutting out of absolutely anybody and everybody who disagrees. And that false memories.
Yeah.
False memories. And one of the things, I feel like I'm just advertising my webinars. So there's one about love, and it's there to show people that one of the things that you can do if you're seeing your child is get out the photo album.
Yep.
Get out the photo album, because image memory is so incredibly important. Image memory is ancient. Image memory is one of the first memory systems that develops. So get out the albums and go through and look at pictures and say, well, who's that? And go into the history of that person. Go absolutely in. So you're getting actually facts, and these are coming into the child's brain and being associated with an image. And I always, as part of my assessment, got children with each parent to do family trees of the other parent. That was to do with an assessment to see if the child was able to do it with the parent they were with. But it's a nice tool for people who, are trying to get children to stabilize with, the alienated parent. And films, E.T., that sort of thing. Things that you can share, lovely moments.
Right.
It's not much.
Yeah, I use that a lot. Like if I have a parent that's alienated and they finally get the opportunity to be with their child, I try to encourage them to make a photo book for the child when they come to visit. And then every time they visit, add more photos of the experiences. So when they come back, they look at those photos and they remember, and then they get excited about building on that as well. But we know that it's great in theory, and it's great if you have access to your child and you have parenting time, but when you don't, it makes it incredibly difficult. So a question I get a lot on the same topic that we're talking about is, my child's been alienated. Literally overnight, they've changed. I went from having a loving relationship to them confiding in me and saying, I don't want to be with that parent. Please do not make me go with that parent. These are things they'll say to the targeted parent. And then something happens in the court case and the child's now in that alienating parent's care. Within 24, 48 hours, that targeted parent communicates with that child or visits that child, and it's like the child rejects them. It's they're dumbfounded. They're at a loss. They're like, Charity, how does that happen? But it goes back to what you're saying. It's that fear.
It is fear. I mean, I've looked at this over, 20 years, but also in terms of criminal proceedings with children, and seen children can as quickly as within 10 days completely change. So they can flip from a strategy of compliance, of alignment, into suddenly this full of hate, as I was saying, this flip into this opposite strategy. And it's when it's usually at a particular age. It's usually when it can happen really, really quickly and become entrenched. With younger children, it's very, very hard for them to sustain the hatred. They might say it, but they can't really sustain it because they don't actually have the neurological architecture that supports that level of cognition. So if you can get them seeing, if you can get the contact, then the hatred will come and go.
Yeah.
But when you get to the big leap that happens in adolescence, this is where the danger zone is, because things can be very, very rapidly entrenched. So it's a specific vulnerability. But this flip can happen. And I went and talked to an anti-terrorist organization called Quilliam, because I wanted to share with them the fact that I had seen over and over again children who were taken from very harmful parents, put into a lovely foster care placement, and within a week had become monstrously violent, full of hate, and very, very dangerous. And the reason is because they're no longer in the controlled environment. They're no longer in the controlled environment. And so all the inhibited rage, fear, distress, because these are fundamental emotions. These are fundamental emotions that if they're distorted over childhood, then they're sitting in there like a time bomb.
Right.
You take them out of that controlling environment and you put them into somewhere that is loving and gorgeous, and these children, the bomb will go off. The bomb will go off. It won't just go off in their behavior. It goes off in the way they think. And if they've been subject to, massive harmful brainwashing for years, then the level of distortion, their brains can't cope. This is when you get when children the residence is transferred and you get children behaving very, very badly. It's because they're in more relaxed surroundings. The problem comes is that, the alienated parent quite often will see it as bad behavior, and they will think, we've got to control it. Well, these children have been controlled by the alienator. It's not bad behavior, it's release. And of course, the other thing is sometimes they get diagnosed with ASD and ADHD because of that behavior, and that's not what it is. It's trauma. And I've forgotten your original question.
No, I mean, that was basically what I was trying to get but I do have one more question is, for these children, whether they're residency transferred or whether they remain in the care of that alienator after whatever age, but let's just say preteen, and they are now in the care of the alienator preteen, and false allegations of abuse presented themselves during the trial, which is why the alienated parent lost custody. And the child initially, in the beginning, obviously, to your point, they know the truth, but over time, do they forget the truth? Like you said, there's implanted memories. So those positive memories get erased over time with the alienator's influence. But then as they get older, they begin to take on a story of their own against that alienated parent that's almost worse.
And it entrenches, it's worse round adolescence as the brain is changing completely and utterly. And that's when things can get really, really entrenched. And as I said before that, it's more difficult. Children are extremely suggestible at a younger age, extremely suggestible, but they can't really hold on to hatred and false memories. And you see in the forensic interviews with children, young children, who've, been indoctrinated to say that they're, obviously it's usually fathers who are falsely accused of sexual abuse. And you see in their forensic interview, they don't go anywhere because there's no evidence, because it's not true. And they're very, very easy to read. And again, we've got, wealth of tools that can get to the truth here, that can get to, is this child telling the truth? You examine the narrative. Again, it's to do with discourse analysis and behavioral language and that sort of thing. So you can get to the truth. But when you get to the older child, where these false memories, they're just getting bedded down, it's really, really difficult. It's very, very difficult. And it would take a long period of being without seeing the alienator. And one thing that should be remembered is that you can take children away. It takes as little as seeing a photo of the alienator to make them go straight back. Because the thing is, the brain has been changed. The brain has been changed, and one little image, and it goes straight back to the bits of the brain that have been changed. That's, the brain damage is permanent, but because of the brain's plasticity, you can do something about it, but only if you can get them away from that alienating environment.
So that brings me to another question. So many alienated parents say, when my children become adults, when they're 18, there's going to be hope that they're going to come back. And there's been a ton of research and books on adult alienated children that do come back, and some reasons why, of age, they separate, they become parents themselves, a partner or a family member encourages their reunification. There's a multitude of things, but so many people want to know, Melanie, and you may not have the answer, but curious on your thoughts. What are the percentages of those children that do come back when they become adults? What does that look like?
I don't know. I have to say I don't know, but I do know that the level of psychopathology in the alienating parent I've seen over the last 20 years has become more complex, more antisocial, more harmful. And because of that, 20 years ago, I wasn't talking about children having the potential to become narcissistic themselves. And now it was in because I was dealing with really complex cases. You could see that over and over and over again. Even, the path that some young children were going down because of what you had assessed in the alienating parent. So, and then we look at society and we see the level of collective narcissism and the level of individual narcissism. And I would say that these cases are pumping out like a factory narcissistic children. So the dynamic situation, it's got worse. It's been like a domino effect, because of course, if you have parents with psychopathology producing children with psychopathology, it's getting worse and worse. And yet what's happening in terms of training up the professionals to go in and explain that and get the courts to absolutely realize how unique what's going on is, and that it's got to be treated knowing the unique stuff, and especially, the brain damage. Because to them, what I think courts go, look, that's working. Oh, look, they're smiling. Look, they've said this. Everything's okay. Let's move on. But we have the tools to get to the bottom of it, and we most certainly have the tools to address it. And yet we're being, rubbished, cancelled across the world. So we fight.
Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Attachment is forever. Attachment is forever. Your child has you in their brain and their body. Watch my webinar, because it's got some really lovely films in it, the one on love. But that's what you need to know. And that, as you've just said, you hope that the adult will start, thinking, especially if they get together with somebody who is very stable and who has a loving family at the back of them, and they can the discrepancies start to build up, and they have to find explanations instead of just using dichotomous thinking and wiping it out.
Great. Okay, so we want to make sure that we share your webinar, and we want to make sure that our listeners, my listeners, anyone who watches our podcast knows your services. So why don't you give us a quick rundown of the name of your webinar, and then I'll provide your contact details should your services be needed. But why don't you give us a rundown on what those services are?
Well, I mean, I am an expert. I assess, though. To a degree which is quite ridiculous. And that's what I do. I do not do therapy, but getting to the bottom of why is so important, I think, for parents and children and for courts, You know, we need to know why. What is going on in this family? So what I'm going to be doing in the next few months is, because it's becoming almost impossible for us as professionals to work the normal way,
Right.
I'm going to be offering assessments instead of going to court. So instead of going to court, assessments, and also I'm teaming up with my partner, who is a specialist schema therapist and is trained in a form of couples therapy that will blow your mind. It is not like any couples therapy, and it is to try and get parents into a position where they can be civil to each other and they can put the needs of their children first instead of fighting. So we'll offer a package where, you know, they'll be given the adult attachment interview, and we'll find the problems then so that they can go and address them. And then this form of therapy, which will get them so that it's not a fight. Because even when parents are just civil to each other, that improves children's mental health immeasurably. So I'll be doing that. And the other thing is, I'm an expert in false allegations. You know, false allegations made by children, false allegations made by parents. I've been trained in child forensic psychology, and I'm also now doing behavioral science and credibility analysis. So, you know, what I've always wanted to do is get to the bottom of why this is happening and then try and solve it.
Melanie, I will make sure and share your contact details. And thank you so much for being a guest on the Fractured Families podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me on this episode of the Fractured Families podcast. I hope our conversation has provided you with support, understanding, and actionable insights to help you navigate your own family challenges. Remember, healing is a journey, and reaching out for help is a sign of strength. You're not alone in it. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach more families in need. You can contact me on social media at Parental Alienation is Real, and visit our website for additional resources and ways to get involved. Stay strong, stay connected, and keep fighting for the family bonds that matter most. Until next time, take care and stay resilient.